What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for Supergirl Season 4, Episode 4, titled Ahimsa. So the first thing I want to talk about in this review is the new costume, which, after watching this episode, we learned that it is actually a temporary costume, and it is very, very temporary. I think that this costume actually looks really good, except for the helmet. Honestly, if she just gets rid of the helmet, adds a cape, it would be a much better costume than the one she currently has. I think that the costume that she's had since the first episode of the show is very, very old, and it's definitely due for an upgrade. So this costume, I think, would be a lot better. Obviously, the helmet doesn't look really good. I mean, it looks like a Power Ranger helmet, honestly, and I think that that wouldn't really fit the character. But just get rid of the helmet, add a cape. It would be a great upgraded costume compared to her old costume. But we learned from this episode that this costume is actually very, very temporary. It probably will not even show up in the next episode at all, or any episode in the future for that matter, which is weird to me because in every single trailer this costume was very focused on. There was a whole trailer that showed nothing, no new footage except for this costume, and that's just really weird because there's only one episode, so the trailers were a little bit of a misdirect. It's a kind of annoying because I do like this costume minus the helmet a little bit more than her, actually a lot more than her regular costume. So I think that the trailers definitely shouldn't have focused on this costume so much. That being said, the storyline that this costume led to was, well, not great, definitely not bad either, which was that Supergirl was struggling because she was trapped in the suit, not really able to help, but she really wanted to help. That storyline was fine. It wasn't great or anything, but just because this episode didn't really have anything great in it. It wasn't anything great about the episode, except for maybe one character who was newly introduced and the death of certain characters, but that's really it. This episode didn't really do anything amazing. There were some things that were good, and the storyline with Supergirl was just good, although it was the part with Alex. Alex was definitely the stronger part of that storyline, and she had her own storyline as well, which is that she was struggling as the DEO leader or director of the DEO. But again, in this episode, I think first of all the actress did a pretty great job in the role, especially in that one scene where she was screaming at Supergirl and telling Supergirl she doesn't follow her orders. That was a good scene, but this storyline didn't feel like it really mattered. It just felt like it was setting up the president sending Colonel Haley over to the DEO, which, by the way, Colonel Haley is a character who was introduced at the end of the episode, and she was given a very large entrance, a very showy entrance, where she was shown as this character who will have a big influence on the show. And the problem with her entrance is that she is not a comic book character, or if she is, she's such a minor one that I don't even know about her, and she's not even on the DC wiki. So to give her such an entrance like that is kind of ridiculous to me. Also, I really don't like when they introduce new characters to the shows, especially series regulars or main characters that are not actually comic book characters, because the comic book characters are why I watch these shows. So Colonel Haley, she's given such a huge entrance, which is not even a character in the comics. It's a little weird to me, and it kind of subtracts from the episode just a little bit. But to contrast with Colonel Haley, there was a new DC character introduced in this episode, and that is Manchester Black. Manchester Black is a very prominent Superman villain. He's even been given his own animated movie as a villain in, I think 2011, and I thought he was pretty good in that movie, but he was actually even better in this episode. I thought the actor they chose was a great choice for the role, despite the fact that he's actually white in the comics, and it seems like they took the name Manchester Black very literally, but honestly, I don't have a problem with that for this specific character. I think the actor was great in the episode, and I think that he can turn out to be a very good recurring villain for the season. He wasn't a villain in this episode at all, and his storyline was pretty good, but he definitely is becoming a villain in the show. My only problem with him is that they didn't really give him his telepathy / telekinesis powers. He might develop those powers in the future, but the reason I have a problem with that is because, one, those are his powers in the comics, and two, if he is given those powers, he could be a good rival for Martian Manhunter, and that rivalry was at least a little bit built up in this episode, so hopefully he gets those powers, and hopefully he could be a good recurring villain for the season. But speaking of the storyline with Martian Manhunter, so this is a storyline that the episode is named after because Fiona, Manchester Black's fiance, used to say it. And first of all, I thought that she died in the first episode because I think Agent Liberty stabbed her and then left her for dead. I don't understand how she's still alive, and I think honestly if they didn't bring her back for this episode, I think the reason they did that is to give an emotional death for her right next to Manchester Black, but I think it would have been a little bit more effective if she did die in the first episode and then Manchester Black, or it was revealed to him through something, or through him seeing her dead body, that she has been dead for the last couple of weeks and he couldn't stop it. I think that would have been a more effective villain origin story for him rather than the one we saw in this episode. Also, it would have made more sense for her to die in that scene in episode 1. But the actual storyline was basically John Jones being guilty about the fact that he didn't help Supergirl, and that got Supergirl poisoned, and Manchester Black looking for Fiona. First of all, I thought John Jones in the storyline, while the character wasn't bad, the fact that he never turned into a Martian was so jarring. It's usually very jarring, but in this episode it was in particular, because there was this one fight scene which I thought was a relatively good fight scene. I know I'm saying relatively good a lot, but that's just my opinion on this episode. It's relatively good. But John Jones in that fight scene never turned into a Martian, never turned into Martian Manhunter, which is completely ridiculous. Honestly, at this point, I would rather John Jones not be on the show at all than him be on the show and never turn into Martian Manhunter, because what would be the point? Because it's just like a tease the entire time. But other than that, on the fact that Fiona probably should have stayed dead from episode 1, I thought this storyline was pretty good. Manchester Black was definitely the highlight of this episode in general, and like I said earlier, I'm really hoping he returns as a recurring villain, which he is. I'm hoping he becomes a good recurring villain for this season. There was one more storyline in this episode which had to do with James Olsen, aka Guardian, where he came back to being Guardian and then subsequently became a symbol of hatred towards aliens. First of all, Nia Nal predicting the fact that this would end poorly is her powers in the comics. She predicts stuff in the future, which was probably some sort of hint towards that. It was also hinted in a previous episode where Brainy and Nia Nal met up, and then Brainy said that he knows her from somewhere because Nia Nal is a member of the Legion of Superheroes in the comics, so those powers were probably teased in this episode. But back to the Guardian storyline, I thought it was nothing much to talk about. I'm not really interested in the character at all, especially when he's Guardian, because he shouldn't be Guardian. It's kind of ridiculous that he is, and in this episode it was no exception. It wasn't very interesting. It was easily the least interesting part of the episode, which I would say is probably saying a lot. There were two things in this episode that were really, really good. One of them is the scene between Lena and Brainy, mostly because Brainy was really great in that scene. The acting was great, the writing was great for that scene, really top-notch scene. Then there was the fact that the Graves siblings both were killed off. Those guys sucked, and I'm so glad they're finally dead. That being said, they were both big parts of this episode, so it just sucks they waited till the end of the episode to kill them off, because this episode definitely was hurt by the fact that they were in the entire episode until the end. So in conclusion, this is one of the better episodes of the season so far, which is something that is really weird to say and probably pretty sad for the season to say, just because this episode is pretty mediocre. I do really like Brainy in this episode. Manchester Black is a pretty great addition to the show, and they finally killed off the Graves siblings. But then again, the Supergirl storyline, the Alex storyline, and the John Jones storyline were all pretty just relatively good. They weren't great or anything, and then the Graves siblings were killed off, but they were also in the actual episode, so there were some positives, but there were also some negatives, and even though this is one of the better episodes of the season, that doesn't mean it's a very good episode, so I'll give this episode a 6.4 out of 10, but let me know what you thought about the episode in the comments down below, and if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.